Hello, happy room to see, where there's always room to see how countries compare. This is Studio Room to See. I'm Andrew Kinane. Welcome back to another lesson in AP Comparative Government and Politics as we help you prep during this very unusual time for a particularly extraordinary exam, that is AP Comparative Government and Politics. Today is our first lesson in Unit 2 as we explore the different institutions of government. For those of you who are institutionalists and feel comfortable learning about the executive systems and parliaments and legislatures and judiciaries, this is your sweet spot in Unit 2 as we look at the different structures of the 6 different core countries of AP Comparative Government. Welcome back. And we are moving forward. Oh, there we go. I'm Andrew Kinane from the suburbs of Chicago. And as I've told you before, get these materials at the College Board course description. You can go to your AP Students College Board page. You can also get the PDF if you take a picture of that link and download that resource. That's a terrific test prep, particularly if you fill in the details of country examples, which is a lot of what today's lesson is about. You can see a lot of my notes if you go to citizenu.org, go to the comparative corner that Mr. Dan Larson's put in there, and you can see a PDF of a lot of the notes that I put into my slides. Just a reminder that the exam is May 22nd at 12 Eastern time. And if you want more information on the exam format and the 2 FRQs, you can go to the website that College Board has provided with the different revisions. We always want to start with a shout out. We had one shout out, but man, the quality of the shout out made up for the lack of quantity. But if you have a special teacher that you want to give a shout out, if you have a special classmate who's helped you through AP Comparative, who you miss spending time with in the class, we are ready for special shout outs. Today it's Mr. Bellows from DVHS, from a super student named Supa Shrey. Shrey, I'm not going to lie, when I saw your Twitter name, I thought it was Supra because I love teaching about supranational organizations. Well, Shrey's tribute to Mr. Bellows is absolutely extraordinary, a supra compliment. So check that out at hashtag CompGov2020. Again, we're accepting shout outs for those special teachers and classmates who you miss spending time with in the classroom. But here we are in a very large classroom, a digital classroom, if you will, and we had some pretty cool moments on social media last night. We continue to get tweets from Nigerian activists. Make sure you check out hashtag APCompGov2020. Different articles are being linked to that hashtag. Just today, a political cartoon about Nigeria's governmental response to COVID-19. Really interesting that somewhere in Nigeria, hashtag APCompGov2020 has caught on from political activists. So make sure you check that out. We want to thank Ethan out there with a really great example of when it came to political stability in this question in China. Why did China come in with so much coercion and force against protesters in Hong Kong who were protesting the fugitive extradition bill into the fall of 2019? Remember, before COVID-19 and the shutdown of Wuhan, there was a huge story coming out of China and their treatment of citizens in Hong Kong and residents who are protesting the government's actions there with that bill. And so Ethan was really questioning the role of stability, or the question of would that bill or the protests be seen as weakening the stability of the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party. So Ethan, thank you for that example. We also had a terrific, do yourself a favor, if you have never Googled the term Dodgy Dave, after today's lesson, make sure you, I'm going to reference it later too, Google Dodgy Dave and treat yourself to a few minutes of hilarity and also a lesson, a meaningful lesson about the House of Commons in the United Kingdom and the role of what we call question time. Question time is actually a vocab word that we're going to look at today as we start Unit 2 and look at parliamentary systems. But it features, well, I'm not going to give away, no spoilers, but it is definitely going to be worth it if you have never seen the video clip Dodgy Dave from the UK's the House of Commons question time. So put that on your list of must viewing tonight. We had an interesting discussion on hashtag APCompGov 2020. The question I left you with yesterday is, what is your ideal form of government? Parliamentary, presidential, semi-presidential? And I gotta say, Chris G and Alex Dewey, Ben Rocks, I don't think they know each other. I know they're not in the same class. They got in a very intriguing, substantial conversation on social media, one of the benefits of Twitter. And their conversation was about what they viewed as the better forms of government between parliamentary and presidential and semi-presidential. Of course, I also have a student, Mr. Ethan Melman, who says that really the best form of government is some version of a monarchy. We left that off the list. And Ethan wasn't online, but thank you for that discussion, gentlemen, on the what they view as the best form of government. Actually, reading that discussion kind of brought me back to some of the best parts of being in the classroom and conversations with Jason Siegel and Ethan, with curious students. We have created, Mr. Larson and I, along with a civics group called Mikva Challenge, we have created a, not a contest, but a showcase, if you will, where we like to showcase students from the suburbs of Chicago and their ideas for governmental reforms. So this actually goes in with that conversation that we had last night on hashtag APCompGov 2020. You can check out that hashtag. I posted a link to the guidelines on if you're interested in creating a showcase project, where if you purport a governmental reform that maybe you've studied in one of the AP 6 countries that you think your national or regional or local government should adopt, put together a short presentation of 5 to 8 slides. And there are documents on how you can do that for the May 4th e-showcase at projectcivicsworks.org. We'd love to have you participate in a national, international political science fair, if you will. We can call it a political science fair for May the 4th. Today, we are looking at institutions. We are starting Unit 2. We are focused today on the difference between parliamentary systems, presidential systems, and semi-presidential systems. We're going to connect that into tomorrow. It is 2 for Thursday today. Tomorrow, we're just going to focus on executive power and executive systems. So we always link a topic to other topics and other concepts that we see throughout the course, but particularly in the first 3 units, because we know the exam is focusing on the first 3 units. You will see that I have covered material from Unit 5. I'll do a day of review on Unit 4 before we get to that May 1st deadline where these YouTube lessons end, because you're going to see that a lot of the concepts that we cover in comparative government in the first 3 units directly apply to concepts and content that enriches the course in Units 4 and Units 5, that if you take a political science course in college, and we certainly hope you take political science in college, we specifically hope you take a comparative government course in college, you're going to learn about party systems and policies and economic policies and social policies that you see in Units 4 and 5. So we will cover that material. And of course, if you've been watching, I do a lot of questions, and I have a question today, an FRQ that I think you'll find helpful to understand this content. So what do you need to know? A lot of vocab today as we get into institutions, some overarching words related to the major institutions that we study in terms of governing systems, the legislature, the executive, judicial branches. We're focused today on parliamentary, presidential systems and semi-presidential systems. And then there are some specific words that are mentioned in that course description, specific words that relate to particularly a parliamentary system that we see, particularly in the United Kingdom, which is the only parliamentary system of the AP 6 countries. And we'll get into some words today, particularly pay attention to words that if it's the first time you've seen it, I'm going to show you some examples. So obviously, you can never fail understanding the basics of each branch of government, that legislatures write laws. They write policies. Sometimes we use policy making as a synonym for lawmaking, but that's the role of legislatures. We know that executive branch, they enforce the law, they implement the laws. And something that many executive branches share is that their head of government has, in some cases, flexible rules for shaping policies or shaping those laws that the executive is implementing. And of course, then we have the judicial branch, and their responsibility is to hear cases, apply the law, and interpret the law. And depending on the system of government, judges in some cases have a lot more leeway and discretion to kind of shape the interpretation of law. But we'll get into that when we look at judicial branches. But never forget those key basic functions of branches of government in every country that we study. So even more authoritarian governments, they have a constitution that empowers their legislature to write the laws. Now, there's some different relationships that we'll get into in Unit 2, but don't forget those core responsibilities of the branches of government. When it comes to the three different systems that we want you to know for AP Comparative Government, like I mentioned before, the parliamentary system, the case study example is the United Kingdom. In parliamentary systems, I mean, each of the countries that we study has a legislature that make the laws. We talked about that. They have an executive branch, but a parliamentary system is unique because a parliamentary system fuses or combines, they merge the powers and functions of the legislature with the executive branch. And so specifically, the United Kingdom is in some ways a good example of a parliamentary government because the head of government, the prime minister, is in fact selected for that role by the national legislature. So specifically in the United Kingdom, the House of Commons selects the head of government, the prime minister. So Boris Johnson, who is a seated member of parliament, is selected as the prime minister by the House of Commons, thereby making the United Kingdom a parliamentary government because the head of government is the head of government, but he's also a sitting member of the national legislature. So those are kind of fused, the legislature and the executive. So that's where you can use that word fused. And if you've studied United Kingdom as a case study, you probably have seen that fusion of power or that word fused powers. We also know that in a parliamentary system, this typically means that the executive, the cabinet, the prime minister are suggesting legislation. They might be drafting legislation. That legislation does have to be formally approved by the legislature. But because that prime minister tends to come from the majority party, particularly in the case of the United Kingdom, the legislature, controlled by the majority party, almost always approves the prime minister or the head of government's suggestion for legislation. And that's the way the United Kingdom works, with some notable exceptions. And particularly, we saw in this school year, going back to 2019, some really notable votes in the House of Commons in the United Kingdom, where the majority actually voted against some of the prime ministers, particularly Prime Minister Theresa May, who was the previous prime minister, rejecting the government's suggestion at legislation for the withdrawal from the European Union. But that's very uncommon. Typically, when it comes to policymaking in a parliamentary government, the parliament is acquiescing. They're approving the executive's decisions. Of specific note, in the United Kingdom, there is an upper chamber. The parliament is considered to be bicameral, if you will, and that upper chamber is called the House of Lords, but it's very weak. The House of Lords can delay legislation. They can suggest amendments or changes to legislation. In terms of a budget bill, they can maybe delay the bill for up to 30 days. It's a very weak upper chamber, which is very common in the countries that we study that are bicameral. The upper chambers tend to be weak. We have two notable examples. Now, College Board in the course description actually lays out that the United Kingdom was an example of a parliamentary, and they indicate that Mexico and Nigeria are examples of presidential systems. And presidential systems have an executive cabinet that's responsible to the elected executive. So in many cases, a president in a presidential system, the president, who is also the head of state and head of government, they are selecting their cabinet ministers. And there is a legislature that is elected separately. There is some oversight by the legislature, so that legislature is typically independent in many ways, including they have an independent or separate elections that are done at the district level or regional level for legislature. While in a presidential system, there's some form of national election to elect the president. And there are also fixed terms for a president. And we know that the legislature can sometimes impeach members of the cabinet, as we see in Mexico and Nigeria. And there's some process for investigating or removing the president, which indicates the legislature is independent in a presidential system. We also know that a president in Mexico and Nigeria serves two roles. They're both the head of state and the head of government. And those are terms we're going to explore a lot more tomorrow as we look at executive systems, as we look at what's the difference between a head of state and head of government, and how does that compare in our 6 different countries. In a presidential system, the president of Mexico and the president of Nigeria hold both of those responsibilities, head of state and head of government. In a semi-presidential system, there's a head of state like Russia. Russia's an example of a semi-presidential system. We don't study France as a case study, but Russia's semi-presidential system in many ways was borrowed from the current French constitution. So Russia's constitution comes from 1993, it was ratified in 93. France's semi-presidential system began in 1958. And the way a semi-presidential system works is that you have an elected president through a national election who is the head of state, but then the president appoints a prime minister, and that prime minister, who has to be approved by the legislature, serves as the head of government, okay? And in this case, you have members of the cabinet who are responsible or held accountable by both the president and the legislature. So it's a hybrid of a parliamentary and a presidential system. And the term we use in comparative political science to describe a system like Russia, where you have a separate person as the head of state who's elected nationally, and who appoints the head of government, is called a semi-presidential system. Russia would be our example. What's interesting is, what about China? What about Iran? Those are left out of the course descriptions. Those are particularly unique in terms of how the head of state gets that power, who the head of state is in terms of Iran, who the head of government is. And so if you have thoughts about how to categorize China or Iran, we'd welcome those. I'm not sure what your teacher has said. I have my particular opinions, but I'm gonna hold off on those. We'll see what maybe your comments are, your insights, and also of the future of Russia. I have to admit that Russia sometimes gives me anxiety, like COVID-19, and sometimes I just avoid the news, particularly any news about possible constitutional changes coming in Russia down the road. So from what you've read about future Russia constitutional changes, how would Russia in the future, if that were to happen, how would you categorize Russia's government down the road? So we'd welcome your ideas and insights at #APCompGov2020. Some other things you should note about parliamentary systems is that a parliamentary system like the United Kingdom has fewer institutional obstacles to enact policy. So as I was mentioning before, that instead of having divided branches of power, where in Mexico and Nigeria, we have independent branches of the legislature who can check the executive, in a parliamentary system, you have this fusion between the executive and the legislature, which means that in a country like the United Kingdom, a parliamentary system, that it can be quicker and less complicated to pass meaningful policies. Now, what I just said 5 minutes ago contradicts this, right? The withdrawal from the European Union is a complicated policy that the House of Commons was blocking. But that's really not typical. And if you look at a different example that we've mentioned before, it's particularly a huge idea of giving more governmental powers from the central government to the regional governments, what we call devolution. That happened in the late 1990s very quickly and without much controversy, because the prime minister at the time, his party was behind that idea. And so it passed really quickly without the checks and balances that you would see in a presidential system. So in a parliamentary system, the executive almost always secures approval because the executive is the head of government and is usually also the head of the majority party of the legislature. There are exceptions, like I mentioned with the withdrawal from the European Union after the Brexit vote. And again, that's another note about the House of Lords being an upper chamber in Parliament in the United Kingdom, but with very limited powers. So just to review and preview the next slide, the Prime Minister is the head of government in the United Kingdom. He is the leader, or she is the leader of the national legislature. When you have a parliamentary government, we typically call the head of government the Prime Minister. I'm also going to go over words here that come up in the course description indirectly. Words like fixed term election is when you have an election system where there is a particular timeline on when that election happens. Maybe it's every 4 years, maybe it's every 5 years, maybe it's every 6 years, or whatever Russia is going to move to. That's a fixed term election. We also have this word of executive bureaucracy. That bureaucracy is part of the executive branch that this is the departments or agencies that typically the cabinet oversees. Every country has bureaucracy. Democracies and authoritarian governments, they have some form of executive bureaucracy to implement laws. And in many cases, those laws were actually written by the national legislature. And then specific to the United Kingdom, we do have this word that you should know, and that is question time. And question time, I referenced earlier, if you Google search Dodgy Dave, that's that moment when members of the chamber or members of the national legislature can question the cabinet. They can question the prime minister. They can question the executive branch about how the executive branch is implementing laws. That's what we call question time. Or in the United Kingdom, we know that happens every Wednesday. Is called Prime Minister Question Time. So we know that the course description asks us to be aware that parliaments may censure cabinet members, refuse to pass executive legislation, question the executive and cabinet members, and impose time deadlines in calling new elections. So these are checks on the executive in a parliamentary system. One of those that's referenced is in terms of questioning the executive in the United Kingdom, that's specifically that question time, the prime minister question time or question time of cabinet members. And this is particularly where that party out of power, in today's case in the United Kingdom, that's the Labour Party that's out of power, and the other alternative parties, they can try to call the executive out, the prime minister or the cabinet ministers, on how laws are being implemented, to call out perhaps scandals or what's viewed as corruption, playing that watchdog role of a political party, or they can use question time to kind of point out hypocrisies, trying to hold the majority party and the executive branch, the cabinet, accountable for their implementation of laws. Specifically in the House of Commons in 2011, they changed their election system where they passed what's called they created a fixed term election system. It used to be a tradition that the House of Commons would have an election every 5 years. And at any point, a prime minister under the old system could call an election within a 30-day period. That's changed somewhat in 2011 when the House of Commons adopted a fixed term election. What makes that complicated is we've only had one fixed term election since 2011, and that was in 2015. The House of Commons election that year was considered a fixed term election because it had taken place pretty much exactly 5 years after the 2010 election. I know Mr. Larson's laughing because I'm getting into a lot of numbers, which he thinks means math. So it probably gets complicated. And he's probably right. It is a little bit complicated. There's been only one fixed term election in the United Kingdom, and that was 2015. The two elections that we've had since 2015, 2017, when Theresa May's Conservative Party won a almost majority. They had plurality control over the chamber. And then in 2019, when Boris Johnson's Conservative Party did win a majority of the House of Commons, both of those elections in 2017 and 2019 were considered what we call snap elections because they were not 5 years from the last election date. And according to this law, the Fixed Term Election Act from 2011, you can have an election within a 5-year time period if a supermajority of the House of Commons agrees to support that. So I think it's a little bit detailed, but it's one of the reasons why we've had 2 different elections in the House of Commons since 2015. There was supermajority of Commons called for that election. Presidential and semi-presidential systems also have divided powers among governmental branches, which allows the legislature to more commonly change or reject executive policy proposals. So there is a division of branches in presidential and semi-presidential systems, which theoretically allows the legislature to check the executive more. And the example of that would be in Nigeria. Nigeria has actually provided a couple of really good examples of checks and balances, if you will, between the legislature and the executive branch. Years ago, the legislature rejected the then president's attempt to extend his term past the 2-term limit, and the legislature said no in Nigeria. A more recent example is in 2016, when the president was trying to pass a budget that was it was too dependent on borrowing from foreign loans, and Nigeria's Senate rejected that proposal. So that'd be an example of that check from a legislature in a presidential system that is represented by Nigeria. If you have more country-specific examples of legislatures that reject executive proposals, particularly in a presidential system, you can tweet those country-specific examples of a legislature rejecting executive proposals. I'd welcome those examples. The community would welcome them at #APCompGov2020. Of course, we always go into some questions at this time. This is our question time, if you will, at AP Comparative Government, where I set you up with some multiple choice questions that you might see on a typical exam year. This is not a typical exam year, but these questions might help you understand some of these concepts and how they apply to countries a little bit more. So our first question is, which of the following is an accurate comparison of countries with parliamentary and presidential systems of government? So on the left, what country has a parliamentary system? On the right column, which country is considered presidential? Of course, I tried to fool you with letter A, since we know the United Kingdom is parliamentary, but of course, you know that Russia is not presidential, which means that the answer is actually C, because Mexico is our presidential system, and that matches up with United Kingdom as a parliamentary system. But this one, we'll flip it around. The countries at the top of the column, which of the following is an accurate comparison of countries with parliamentary and presidential systems of government? I'll give you a chance with Nigeria and Russia. And I know that's not going to take you too long, where we have Nigeria as presidential and Russia as semi-presidential. How about a more traditional multiple choice, if you will? Which of the following is a unique feature of a parliamentary political system? So in this case, we're playing that word association game of, do you understand what the definition of a parliamentary system is? And hopefully you got into letter C. A parliamentary system combines the lawmaking and executive functions, which allows the national legislature to select and remove the head of government and cabinet. And sometimes if we don't use the word combines, we can use the synonym fuses or merges the lawmaking and executive functions as a parliamentary system. How about a presidential political system? Which of those definitions matches up best with a presidential system? And hopefully you came up with letter D. Features a cabinet that is mostly responsible to the executive, the elected executive, with a legislature that can only remove cabinet members through impeachment. And then, of course, you can predict the final multiple choice question, and that is, which is a unique feature of the semi-presidential political system? Russia would be our example of this from our AP 6 comparative countries, and the answer is A, separate popular elections for the president and for the national legislature. But the key to a semi-presidential is that a semi-presidential allows the president to nominate the prime minister. Okay, so even a presidential and a semi-presidential both have separate elections for president and national legislature, but it's only a semi-presidential that allows the president to nominate a prime minister. And that sets us up for today's FRQ. And I'm going to caution you, I'm going to go over a question I wrote that replicates free response question 3 on a typical exam year. We know this is not a typical exam. The exam has been revised. Argument essays will be on the exam, an argument essay, one argument essay. A quantitative analysis question will be on this revised exam. Question 3, which we sometimes call the country comparison or the comparative analysis question, will not be on the exam, but I wanted to write one because I think that the question I write, and you're going to see a style that I recommend my students write with, tries to build good habits of essay writing, and particularly essay writing in AP Comparative Government that helps you communicate clearly, that helps you communicate completely, and most importantly, well, as importantly, helps you make sure that you're actually answering the question fully. So in the case of an AP score, you can maximize your credit. So the question today is, the setup is compare presidential systems in 2 different AP Comparative Government and Politics course countries. In your response, you should do the following: define a presidential system, describe presidential systems in 2 different countries, and then letter C, explain how, very key directive, explain how the presidential systems can affect democratization. Okay, so now we got to connect presidential systems with democratization for each of the 2 AP Comparative Government course countries that you describe in Part B. So, you know, I should have mentioned before today that if you would like to practice these, this could be a time in, depending on how you're watching these YouTube lessons, you can pause it now, you can try to write out your answer, and then you can see how your answer compares to what I'm writing. And maybe you don't pick the same countries, hopefully you pick the 2 countries that are presidential in today's example, but you can compare how you're writing with what I'm describing, kind of where you get the rubric points for this particular question. In today's question, there are 5 potential rubric points available: 1 for letter A, 2 for letter B, and 2 for letter C, so 5 total points. To get the point for letter A, define presidential systems, I like to put a definition, and I also really recommend that you provide an example. In some cases, you can provide an example if you want about a country. Unless the question asks, you don't have to provide an example from one of the course countries. You can also speak generally, and that's an example of what I've tried to do today. First of all, I like to label. I mentioned before, I really believe strongly in graphic design for AP government writing, spacing out sections, creating paragraphs, creating, some of your teachers have rules for 3 or 4 lines between sections or paragraphs. I think a well-structured free response helps you communicate that you're confident in your answer, and it helps direct a reader to correct information. I love well-designed. And so I like to suggest to my students that they label, that they create separate paragraphs. And I know there's, again, I mentioned this yesterday, some different thoughts about labeling, whether to label, whether to not label, whether to erase. There's a lot of debates about this. You can't go wrong with labeling and crossing it out, okay? If you cross it out, it's like it doesn't exist, but you get the benefit of a well-structured essay. But I love the paragraph, I love the section. So this is my definition of presidential system. I just don't stick with one sentence, because maybe my definition's incomplete. My definition sentence is: a presidential system is a system of government in which the president is elected separately from the members of the national legislature. Well, that's pretty good. That's what a presidential system is. But that's also what a semi-presidential system is. A semi-presidential system has a president who's elected separately from members of the national legislature. I got to say more. I got to distinguish it. An example of a presidential, and so I like to encourage you to write an example. Be complete. Write another sentence or 2 about the definition. An example of the presidential system would be a country in which the president holds the roles of head of state and head of government. All right, right there, that's different from semi-presidential because we have one person who holds two roles, selects the executive cabinet, and is elected in a direct popular election, while members of the lower and upper houses are elected by voters in their respective districts and regions. All right, now that's hitting enough to distinguish this definition as a presidential system. Had I just stuck with that first sentence, not getting the point, because that could also be a semi-presidential. So that expand it with an example. If you want to use a country example for that, a question like this, if you got to define this word, you can, but you can just elaborate with an example. In this case, I would get the point because I elaborated. Second part of the question, describe presidential systems in two different AP comparative government course countries. Again, write a separate paragraph. If you see an A, B, or C for one of the questions, the quant analysis, I recommend A, B, C, D, or how many letters are listed, and then cross the letter out. Make sure you answer the question. It's asking me to pick two different countries. I got to name two different countries. Make sure you name it. If you don't name the countries, you're not going to get the points. And there are 2 points in this paragraph on a typical exam year. There would be 2 points in this paragraph. You gotta name two countries, and you got to compare them. So Nigeria and Mexico both have presidential systems. So there's my comparison, in which one individual is elected by national voters as both the head of state and head of government. In both countries, the president appoints the executive cabinet. Also in both countries, members of the national legislatures are elected separately by the president by voters in districts in different regions. So here's where, kind of similar to what I did in my definition, I'm repeating what a presidential system here is, but now I'm connecting that to two countries. I've named both countries. I don't want to just stick with one sentence. I want to elaborate, maybe 2 or 3 sentences to elaborate on comparing two different countries, in this case, Nigeria and Mexico, in order to get those 2 points that are available in the B area. And then finally, for letter C, again, I have to pick my 2 countries that I've referenced in B. So that's Nigeria and Mexico. I want to make sure I get those in there. But here's now where I have to explain how, and you've heard me say this before, when you're asked to explain how or asked to explain why, when you're asked to give a reason in an argument essay, when you're asked to develop a thesis or a claim statement in an argument essay, make sure there's a word of causation. Make sure there's a causal word. Because, therefore, due to are the easiest, most straightforward words of causation. So both Nigeria and Mexico have presidential systems that can increase democratization because both systems allow for national legislatures to act as an independent branch. So here's where I threw this word in that we've looked at before from Unit 1, democratization. And here's where we're building on our knowledge. We're learning about presidential systems today as we start Unit 2, but we're in this type of question, you're really expected to be able to connect a concept from one topic into a different topic, in this case, democratization. So in an essay, I really want to see that word democratization, because that's what you're being asked to do. And I also want to know, how does presidential system affect democratization? Does it hurt democratization? Does it increase democratization? What is the effect? So be clear with your writing. So that's why I said presidential systems increase democratization because both systems allow for national legislatures to act as an independent branch. Don't stop there. Keep on elaborating with examples here, with evidence. In both countries, the constitutions allow the national legislature to try to impeach cabinet members. Having national legislatures that can act independently and check the executive branch is a feature that can increase democratization in both countries. So I want to make sure I'm using that word democratization. I also want to make sure there's a reason. Why is democratization being increased? It's because those branches, that national legislature is independent of the executive branch. Oh, here's an example. The legislature can try to impeach cabinet members. So make sure you answer, don't try to answer this in just one sentence, and for sure, make sure you include a because or some word of causation when you're asked to explain how, and make sure you get all your key concepts in there. How presidential systems affect democratization. So those are my tips to get 2 points and to max out your 2 points. Oh, and most importantly, make sure if it asks for 2 countries, make sure you indicate 2 countries. So those are my tips on essay writing today, free response writing for AP Comparative Government. Don't forget core content. You should know the 3 different branches. Today's topic was looking at presidential, parliamentary, and semi-presidential systems with some specific vocabulary related particularly to the UK's parliamentary system. We will see tomorrow how these topics connect with executive systems. And then the next day, we'll look at the removal of executives. And then further in Unit 2, we'll look at legislatures and how national legislatures operate in our 6 different countries. If you have more specific examples of parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential systems, I'd welcome you to tweet it out. Hashtag APCompGov2020. I am leaving you with this thought. Tomorrow, we're looking at these terms head of state and head of government. These are 2 specific terms when we look at executive systems. In your ideal executive branch, is there a separate head of state from the head of government, or would you merge those 2 roles in your ideal executive branch? I look forward to reading the conversation on Twitter at the hashtag. Again, if you know somebody who's struggling to get technology and access to technology, please encourage them to reach out to the College Board, or maybe you can help them do that at cb.org/tech. Thank you very much for tuning in today to AP Comparative Government. I'll be with you tomorrow, Friday, as we continue now looking at Unit 2 and we explore the executive systems. As always, thanks again and be well.